What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 132, and I'm the host, Kyle Anslone. On today's show, I'm talking to Patrick MacFarlane, who has a excellent new documentary out at the Libertarian Institute, and it's titled Stain of the Century, an investigation of Uyghur genocide allegations. And Pat, this is certainly a topic that we've talked about on the show already, but your new documentary is so good. I really want everyone to watch it, but more importantly, I want everyone to share it because it's something that if my audience watches, we're going to get something out of it. You do a very good job of breaking down the most important content on that topic and laying it out very concisely, and so everybody should have the ammunition they need to argue it. But more importantly, this is for our friends who are bad on these issues. These are the kind of things that get shared in libertarian circles, and just all around. And so, to have the idea of what's actually happening in China with the Uyghurs and it all laid out. Pat, you do an excellent job. You're nuanced on it. I really want everybody to check it out. And so the best place to find that, this show, and pretty much everything that me or Pat puts out is by going to the Libertarian Institute. Check out, again, both of our shows. You can find it in the right-hand column on the page, conflicts of interest. And then I think after you is Keith's show, Don't Tread on Anyone, and then Pat's show, Liberty Weekly, and that's where you can find his documentary, as well as I will go ahead and just embed the YouTube into this, the show notes on my video as well. And so if you're, on my page of the Libertarian Institute, you can find it very easily. Also, check out the show by sharing it on Facebook, MeWe, or Twitter. Pat, I believe you use all of those platforms as well. I'm at Kyle Anslone _ on Twitter. The show is at con _ interest. And Pat, remind me what your handle is.
Yeah, it's Liberty _weekly.
All right. And then support the show. Me and Pat both have Patreons, and I believe you have a Subscribe Star as well set up.
Correct.
And so those are easy ways to donate. We'll also take, whatever other way you want to send us money. I have the crypto links in the show notes page. I'm sure Pat typically has something like that on his show notes page. Also, Odysee is now doing tips, and me and Pat are both using that platform. So it's all YouTube alternative video versions are up there. And definitely, if you watch Pat's video on YouTube, you're going to want to tip the guy a couple bucks because it's something that obviously had a lot of time and effort put into it. Last, before we start to get into the news today, I just want to thank the sponsor of the show and recommend their great CBD products. It's Paloma Verde. The URL is palomaverdecbd.com. The promo code is PEACE, and that gets you 25% off when you spend $75 or more. They have a great lineup of CBD products, gummies, tinctures, soft gels, infused with all kinds of different additives like melatonin to help you get to sleep, or curcumin to help reduce inflammation. But my personal favorites are their topicals. Their sports cream and their Slav are absolutely great. They work very effectively. It doesn't take very much of the product, so you get one of the sports creams bottle. It's gonna last you like a month. I use it every morning, and it works absolutely fantastic. So check out their great lineup of CBD products there at palomaverdecbd.com and use the promo code PEACE when you check out. It lets them know that you came from the show. It helps the show out, and it also gets you a discount. All right, Pat, let's get into the news. And before we get into your China documentary today, I want to touch on a developing story that's very interesting for me and you, right? Because since we've been in elementary school, the U.S. has had the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. And to be quite honest, if you asked me 6 months ago if the U.S. was ever going to leave the Bagram Air Base, I would have really doubted it. The military saw it as a very strategic asset. It's in, Afghanistan, a country that borders Pakistan, China, and Iran. Of course, Iran is the nemesis. China, as we'll talk about, is the country everybody fearmongers about. And of course, the military always wanted a close installation to Pakistan, often because they fear that it's an unstable nuclear arsenal in that country. Although I'm not sure the U.S. trying to go in and take the nukes would make those nuclear weapons any more stable, but that's that's the idea of having this Bagram Air Base. And then on, I believe, July 2nd, or maybe it would have been July 3rd, actually, in Afghanistan, middle of the night, the U.S. leaves. And this is, I guess, something that was in the works. I talked about last week on the show that U.S. troops were leaving. Although, Pat, after 20 years, I would have really guessed that this would have been a very smooth process. The past several months, the U.S. is, training their Afghan replacements and all the different things, making sure they know where all the different things in the base are. I'm sure that some buildings they're going to no longer use. And so, there's tearing those things down or converting them. But that doesn't seem to be what happened. The U.S. left in the middle of the night, turned off the power, and then looters actually entered the base before the Afghan army, the new commander, went and took control. Now, they're just reports of the looting happening, and they are from U.S. mainstream sources, so I do think that they're true. That being said, I'm not sure if they were taking off with cars, or they were looking for some barbed wire, copper piping, something like. I'm not sure if they were actually getting anything of actual value, if the place is torn up and no longer could be used, or if it was 10 looters got there, they took 3 cars and some other things they found in the barracks and got out of there. There's a lot that could be happening there. It's I think people sometimes imagine it's like the streets of Minneapolis in July of last year or something. I haven't seen any videos to suggest it was that severe, but after all this time, Pat, don't you think they could have had a little bit of a plan on how this was going to happen, so that even if they didn't want to have a big ceremony and make a big fuss about it, which I kind of understand why the U.S. wouldn't want to do that on July 4th weekend. However, they probably could have done it in a way where it was they shake the hand of the new commander and the U.S. leaves the base. So even if it does happen in the middle of the night, it's not like the Afghans can't wake up at 3 a.m. to, make that happen and make sure this transition is smooth. How shocking is it to you that it's this chaotic?
I mean, it's just kind of emblematic, it seems, of the whole endeavor. Scott Horton entitled his book Fool's Errand for a reason. And, I'm just really surprised that they didn't just throw everything in a burn pit and then have one big celebration and then leave in a Saigon moment or something.
Right, or they could have even bombed it or something.
Right, yeah. Just right. Drop a tactical nuclear missile and then right off into the sunset.
So, a couple other interesting things here, Pat, just on Afghanistan. A couple of news stories, things, how they're developing that war. Now, with the U.S. closing the Bagram Air Base, the commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, General Austin Miller, I guess, is no longer in that role. That post doesn't exist. But they did create a new post that will be in charge of the U.S. military operations in Afghanistan, and it's going to be headed by Navy Rear Admiral Peter Velazzi, and it's going to be based in the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, which is going to have up to 650 troops there. And so it seems like we scaled down a military base, but we've essentially just converted our embassy into a military base. Matthew Ho and Scott Horton on a fantastic interview. I really think everybody should check that one out. This past week, you could find at the Libertarian Institute. And in that interview, they talk about having radar systems and missile systems to respond to attacks in these embassies. And so this is a pretty serious and probably fortified base that we're going to have in Afghanistan. I think it's also going to make the embassy a target for the Taliban. And so this seems to be a pretty big double-edged sword to me. Now, elsewhere in Afghanistan, some news on the ground in the fighting. The Taliban have taken several districts from the Afghan government in northern Afghanistan. This is along the border with Tajikistan, where the Taliban now have taken several border crossings. And several times the Afghan soldiers have fled across the border into Tajikistan. And in response, Tajikistan has now called up 20,000 of their reservists to go bolster their border forces, and I guess Russia is going to help them in this mission. And so it's interesting to see how this is developing. The fleeing soldiers are going to be returning to Afghanistan, I guess, to re-enter the fight. There's been about 1,000 of them total, and then a total of 2,300 who've abandoned their posts across the country. But particularly these 1,000 who have ended up in Tajikistan, I guess, are now going to cross back over the border and apparently enter the fight. And the Afghan government has announced they're planning a counteroffensive. I'm not sure if it'll actually work out or what's going to happen here. There's a recent area, I don't think it was the same province of Afghanistan, but nonetheless, there was a situation where that they were sending in some commandos in a counteroffensive, and then didn't send any reinforcements for them, and the 20 commandos were killed. And so, Pat, it doesn't look like the situation on the ground in Afghanistan is very good for the U.S.-backed government there, that this mission is successful at all. It's completely falling apart. And even as the U.S. is leaving. In fact, we had some interesting statements recently from Taliban spokesperson, I believe actually the leader of the Haqqani network, saying that they were slowing their offensive because they didn't want to take any provincial capitals until September, as laid out in the Doha Agreement, and also that they were allowing the Afghan fighters to surrender, leave their weapons. They'll even give them money to get themselves home. The Taliban are also hoping to exchange written peace proposals with the Afghan government within the coming month. That would be good news if it actually happens, because the U.S. is leaving soon, and if we get a peace deal in place that will, well, if the actual sides on the ground get the peace deal in place, it may be helpful in relieving the potential violence. And so it's just an absolute mess, Pat, and it's going to continue to unfold over the next weeks. And me and Will be covering on the show. But I guess I talk about today because leaving the Bagram Air Base in this fashion is such a crazy thing to have happened. And you would just think after all this time, they had all this time to plan it out, and they have no clue how to leave still. It's an absolute disaster. Anyways, let's move on and start talking about your documentary, which again posted up on YouTube, Odysee at the Libertarian Institute, Staying the Century, an investigation of Uyghur genocide allegations. This is really fantastic. I'm not going to play a bunch of it on the show because YouTube will give me a copyright flag. But Pat, I was interested in just starting off the interview and why you decided to make it, or, if you're going to make a documentary, because you have done some of these in the past that are of great quality, one on the cops, which is absolutely fantastic. Why'd you pick this subject?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks, Kyle, a lot for your kind words. I really do appreciate it. And it means a lot coming from someone like you. Of course, I've been following your work for a really long time, almost since the beginning. We've been friends for that long. But, at the same time, I was watching a lot of Tim Pool for God knows what reason. And I think it's just because I wanted more of I thought that Tim was more of a neutral take, kind of a centrist, because I thought I was being cultured and unbiased by at least trying to listen to some other people on the political spectrum.
Right. Somebody like a Jimmy Dore who just seems like they have their biases and they're kind of obvious, but at the same time, they're not crazy and they don't have an agenda and they're probably saying what they actually think.
Right. Yeah. And when it comes to Tim Pool, I guess I don't want to put him down too hard because he has a lot of great positions. He's become more and more libertarian. He flip-flopped on Second Amendment stuff. He's been against the culture war, although he believes, I think, that the culture war was invented by the Chinese in large part to kind of disrupt the United States. I'm not making that up. But he has a lot of good positions. He platforms a lot of good libertarians. So I don't want to completely put Tim Pool down, but I was listening to his stuff on his Timcast IRL kind of over the winter, and I realized one week that he was talking an awful lot about China, and he would talk about China almost every single day. And at the same time, I was working on a different documentary about war lies in World War One, specifically propaganda, atrocity propaganda. And it just so happened that I was working on this, and a show came up of Tim Pool talking about how the Chinese government is imprisoning Uyghurs in these camps and how they're systematically raping them and torturing them and they are sterilizing them. And I don't know if he went as far as like mass executions, but he was definitely calling it, no doubt a stain of the century. That's Mike Pompeo's words. But Tim Pool was fully endorsing that and saying that this was maybe the worst atrocity of this century.
Right. So yeah, I mean, you bring up there the people that Tim Pool has on, and he almost comes off to me as a Rogan figure sometimes, where Rogan will have on Tulsi Gabbard, Abby Martin, and Dave Smith, and they'll all talk about Palestine and Yemen, and then he'll have on Mike Baker and agree that's the CIA dude's name, right?
Yeah.
I think
Yep.
so, and
And
then agree with everything that guy says too. So, and Tim Pool will have on Scott Horton and let Scott Horton talk about his anti-war butts, and I mean, like, he pushes back against Scott, and they had, like, I think a good conversation about the war issue. But at the same time, he then has on Steve Bannon, and I mean, I couldn't bear to watch the whole thing, but I watched a little bit, and he seemed almost more agreeable with Bannon than he was with Horton.
yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all. And just a little editorializing here, and obviously my bias is clear. I'm an anti-war libertarian, as are you. This is an anti-war libertarian show. We work at the Libertarian Institute with Scott, but it was very clear to me that Tim was out of his element when he had Scott on, and Scott just knew way more than him about China. And you could see how quickly the conversation was steered into a direction that was not very dangerous for Tim, and that
Yeah,
is
that's a good point.
talking about Dr. Fauci when you have the anti-war guy on.
Yep. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Or trying to focus on maybe more conflicts like the war in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, where it is the popular position to be against those wars. Now that may not make you popular with the intelligence community, but it is like kind of a safe position to hold. 60% of Americans agree we should end those wars. So
Or how about this, Kyle? Sorry to interject here, but why didn't they talk about Yemen? Why didn't Tim bring Yemen up? Because that is a real genocide that's proven that we are complicit in as the United States.
yeah, no, that's an excellent point. I mean, we're looking at 400,000 children they estimate will die this year because of the conflict, and we're into July. We've had this warning the whole time. Biden's been president for 6 months and nothing's really changed, or at the very least, nothing has changed in a way to force any of the parties to change what they're doing. And particularly looking at arming the Saudis and providing the maintenance for their airplanes. And while we say we're just protecting their defensive capabilities, uh, that essentially means allowing them to wage an offensive war in Yemen as well. So to stay on the Uyghur subject, though, I guess one of the things that people are, if they watch this and they don't agree with, anybody who listens to this show isn't going to have this interpretation. But if you even look at the early feedback on your video, Pat, the complaint people will make is that you're being too kind to the Chinese Communist Party, and that you're denying that anything bad is happening to the Uyghurs. Now, the devil's advocate question there. I don't actually believe that you're doing that, but I'll go ahead and let you respond to that.
Yeah, well, discerning the truth is really hard. It's like trying to find the truth and listening to, the U.S. State Department on one side and the Chinese Communist Party on the other side is like trying to determine, I don't know, sift through two known, proven, biased, motivated liars and trying to figure out exactly what's happening here. I think the U.S. government's track record of overthrowing regimes is pretty clear that we've done it a lot throughout history. Maybe that's my ignorance, but I don't believe that the Chinese Communist Party has done the same. However, the Chinese Communist Party is a communist party. It wasn't too long ago that we had the Great Leap Forward. And obviously it's a technocratic surveillance authoritarian society over there. And obviously that's not something that I endorse, but in fact, I would strongly condemn it. But at the same time, we have the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus, the entire military-industrial complex and their lackeys in the media are pushing a coordinated campaign to escalate tensions with China. And they've stated this. This was in what was it, Mattis's 2018 renewed great power competition
Yeah,
pivot.
the national security strategy.
Yep. And so that's the stated goal is that we are going to renew the Cold War with Russia, but mainly China is the focus. And Biden even said, great article by Dave DeCamp covering how Biden said that the 21st century will be defined by competition with China.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent points. So to, I guess maybe expand on that a little bit more, some of the I guess evidence that doesn't come from either the State Department or, I mean, I guess debatable between how many layers of NGO funding you're going to go through, or the Communist Chinese Party. You got Adrian Zenz, China Uncensored, and Fulong Gong, right, are kind of the three people that are producing the evidence. And so I don't know if you have like a particular order you would like to take it in, but I would like to talk a little bit about each of these figures and why because the Tim Pools and the people who just expect you to believe that these bad things are happening, these are the places that they get their evidence. And so let's at least talk about why we shouldn't believe any of these people on the face of their claims.
Yeah, and there's a lot of hay that's been made. Especially, I included a clip of Gareth Porter talking to Scott Horton in the documentary, and he's talking about Adrian Zenz's background. And Gareth Porter says a lot of things about. He makes a lot of hay about how Adrian Zenz is a Christian fundamentalist. He's obviously not a progressive wokester. He doesn't believe in gender equality. I don't particularly care about that. I included it in the documentary because I didn't want to editorialize Gareth Porter. That being said,
And
I think
I guess I would add, Pat, just based on the allowable discord in the U.S. today, that his positions are, if the mainstream media was talking about a Trump supporter with positions they didn't like, they would use these claims to disqualify that person. And it's very interesting that any claims anytime this is discussed in the mainstream media, the name Adrian Zenz is hardly ever mentioned. But if it is, it's not in a way that is. They don't bring up these issues that again they would bring up if it was somebody else, and they would use that to disqualify their opinion.
they would. And I don't I'm not a person, obviously I'm not a person who believes that the ends justify the means, but in some way we have to be a little Machiavellian about this. I mean, these people are blatantly lying. Yeah, I don't want to prescribe motivations upon them, but the more I look into it, the more blatant it seems to me. And to me it seems like the most, not the charitable explanation, but Occam's razor would say that they know what they're doing. They're creating a narrative. That's just my opinion. Um, but at the same time, it's just they are creating this narrative that is very incredibly dangerous. People are buying it hook, line, and sinker. It's all that we hear about if you pay attention to this issue. And I feel like I'm justified, in including that at least. And moreover, I was looking at the federal rules of evidence because I'm trained as an attorney. So when I think about these standards of evidence, and there is a federal rule of evidence 610. You can look it up. There usually you cannot attack someone's religious beliefs to challenge their trustworthiness or their credibility. However, you can attack or question their religious beliefs if they make it in order to show bias or motivation. And so I think since Adrian Zenz says that he's led by God to expose the Chinese Communist Party, I think that warrants a little question and a little exposing into his motivations.
Right. Well, and I remember this is like a vague memory because we're talking about wars that are still ongoing. But for me and you, these were discussions that were happening in the public when we were children. But I believe George Bush, W. Bush, kind of invoked God in a divine mission, and he was rightfully mocked for that. And people were like, this doesn't count as and it makes your motivations. It should make your motivations questionable. Also, if you're on a mission from God, maybe you don't use the same standard of evidence as the rest of us because you see yourself as having some kind of divine right or something like that. People's I think if they believe that there's a divine power that tells them to do something, then the truth of man probably doesn't rank as high as that divine power on their ethics ladder, and so they're gonna make the decisions there. And anyways, there was more substantial things that Gareth said about Zenz that disqualifies him even more.
Yeah, and I don't knock Gareth for saying that, because at the same time, what Gareth says in the clip that I used is, he says it doesn't mean he's wrong outright. It just means that we need to know where he's coming from, and we shouldn't take everything he says, as absolute truth. We know what his motivations are. So, not to a character assassinate him per se. However, so we get into Adrian Zenz's his study. It's a June 2020 study where he claims he analyzes, dives into statistics, and does some. Peter Lee described it as statistical massage to make it look like the Chinese government is committing demographic genocide against the Uyghur people, and he uses pretty much a slowing in the birth growth rate, so a slowing down in the population growth rate to extrapolate and say that genocide is occurring, and essentially he has major snafus in his research. One, he doesn't take into account the shifting child policy. That is that there was a limit on the number of children that families could have in Xinjiang province, and that only applied to the Han Chinese at one point in time. And the Uyghurs, they're a more rural people. Is the Xinjiang province it's called in Chinese it means the new frontier, and it's populated by these Turkic Muslims, the Uyghurs, and they're a rural people, and they have a lot of kids. Rural families, they'll have 8-9 kids in one family. So all of a sudden, I believe is when 2017 or 2018, the limit to 2 for urban couples and 3 children for rural couples began to be applied to the Uyghurs, when in earlier it only applied to the Han Chinese.
And
So
to be clear, that's a repressive policy. However, the argument that they are making is that this is, in a way to eliminate, to suppress the Uyghurs in particular, to dominate the Uyghurs, when in reality, this is a policy that's applied to all people of China.
Yes, exactly. And yes, to be fair, absolutely, that's a horrific policy. Talk about an infringement on liberty. And, not only just for the Uyghurs, but for everyone, the Han Chinese included, who are being limited this way. And, there is evidence that these programs include like some ridiculous, like menstrual monitoring in terrible things like that. So it is crazy.
If I remember correctly, a few other things that were like altering the population or the birth rate of the Uyghurs were things that, had they happened in any Western country or any country the U.S. wanted to tout as a success, I think they would, approve of these policies. Things like, providing contraception to women,
Right.
offering I think the permanent contraception, IUDs maybe. I hope I'm using the right acronym there.
No,
And,
you're right.
just the overall, the wealthier people are. And if you look at a lot of Western countries, the more education, the more careers women have, typically the later that, women's try to start family, and then, the lower chances of them of having kids. These are all things that just happen. And again, if it's in a Western country, it's portrayed as being freeing and a liberation towards women. And here it is, and it's being called a genocide. Again, not that that's the only thing they're talking about, but you got to put all this in context.
Right. And there was a picture that Adrian Zenz used in his study of a free healthcare clinic. And in Gareth Porter and Max Blumenthal's report, they discovered that he used the picture wildly out of context to try and say that this couple was being repressed, when in actuality that this couple's their ability to conceive was being repressed, but in actuality they were like beyond the age that people would have children, and they were just people that were receiving free healthcare at a clinic. We're libertarians, so we don't really believe in free healthcare or anything like that. At least not a government program. Charitable is fine, but
And
here,
certainly not a communist party that rules 1.4 billion people. You know, I hate having to qualify what I say. Although since we're doing a deep dive on China, I guess it's kind of worth it to make this statement. I don't want to live in China, right? I
right.
certainly won't want to be a Chinese Uyghur or a Tibetan or a Hong Konger. Because there is repression from the central government. That being said, if you look at other people I won't want to be around the world, it includes the Palestinians. And we fund the Israeli government. And it's not like every time somebody says something positive about Israel, they're expected to say, but I don't support the oppression of the Palestinians and I wouldn't want to live in Palestine. You know what I mean? There's no implicit assumption that if you say something positive about Israel, you're somehow, endorsing every last thing that the Israeli government does. And here, anytime you say anything along the lines of it may not be that bad for the Chinese Uyghurs, that's somehow equated to, boy, do I love the Chinese Communist Party. And that's not the conversation we're having here. We're just trying to put war propaganda into context because this is the kind of thing that's going to rally Americans to hate China.
Right, and I really don't believe that this is the case. But if everything that the United States were saying about what was happening to the Uyghurs, if all of it were true, I would still, obviously the United States and the Western powers could still use that as propaganda for us to confront China, even if it were all true. And so, it's I don't want to belittle what's happening to the Uyghurs or what seems like is happening to them, and I think we might get to that later, unless you want to dive into it right now.
Yeah, we could go ahead and do that.
Okay, well, one last thing on the Adrian Zenz. This is the biggest statistical misrepresentation he makes. Max Blumenthal found this. Among Zenz's major findings, I'm reading here, was the claim that 80% of all net added IUD placements in China were performed in Xinjiang, despite the fact that the region only makes up 1.8% of the nation's population. According to the 2019 China Health Statistics Yearbook published by the National Health Commission, the original source of Zenz's claim, the number of new IUD insertion procedures in Xinjiang in 2018 accounted for only 8.7% of China's total. So Zenz's major finding appeared to be off by a factor of 10, a staggering error that substantially undermined the explosive quality of his argument. So essentially, the way that he would have it would mean that every woman in Xinjiang would have to have 1,000 IUD placements every day. So it's just on its face, it's
Right.
ridiculous.
Yeah, the numbers don't even work out.
Yeah.
All right.
It,
So, yeah, let's go into talk about what you think the experience of the Uyghurs in China actually is. What are these things that are called by some people concentration camps? That seems to me to go too far. Yeah, I don't think that they're carrying out mass executions in these places or anything like that. Are they work camps? I don't know. Are they voluntary work camps? Maybe. What is actually voluntary? You know what? There's a lot of questions to be had. So, what do you think? Because I know you have spent a ton of time researching and looking into this.
well, of course, with the qualifier, it's hard to say. To me, it really, if we take the Chinese Communist Party at its word, these are wonderful social development programs that are providing job training and opportunities to young Uyghurs. There is some evidence to support this. I'm not going to say that it's completely bonkers just because it's from the CCP, but let's look at it with skepticism. There was a resolution signed by lots of Muslim countries in the surrounding area endorsing these programs because they see it as empowering the mostly poor rural Uyghurs that exists. Also, these Muslim countries have a lot to gain by the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, especially Kazakhstan. And so if you go into some of the topics in the documentary, Bilash is a Kazakh activist who went around procuring a lot of the testimony from Uyghurs to say that their family members were disappeared. Well, he was charged in Kazakhstan for inciting ethnic hatred, but his lawyer alleged that Kazakhstan was bias because they just want to appease China because of the Belt and Road Initiative. So apologies for that aside, but there's so many dots to connect here. So if you take the CCP for its word, these are wonderful, empowering education camps. But the stated reason, and this is very important, the stated reason that China has these camps is because they want to combat extremism and terrorism, because historically there's been a lot of terrorism occurring in Xinjiang, because obviously the Uyghurs feel like they're being colonized and the Han Chinese are moving in and there's social strife there. Um, in the background here, we have the United States being involved with the Uyghurs for, in Syria particularly, but Eric Margulies in my documentary talks about how Uyghur terrorists were being trained in Afghanistan with Osama bin Laden and the ISI being aided through third parties by the United States and the CIA. So if we take the CCP at their word, that's what they are. I think that the CCP is charging Uyghur terrorists, some of them unjustly, maybe a lot of them unjustly, and I feel like they are sentencing some extremists to these camps. Now, we know in the United States that extremists can be massaged to encompass a lot of normal folks. So it wouldn't surprise me if there were people unjustly imprisoned in these camps.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess that is another thing, right, to think about here too, is how much worse is it than the U.S. Because I feel like that's kind of got to be the standard for trying to qualify something, and how likely is it that you end up in one of these camps, and then it doesn't sound like it's probably all that much worse than like some of the U.S. prison system situation where the work is voluntary with pretty loose definition of that, which means you could end up in solitary confinement if you refuse, or you can't get access. You basically have to work so that you could get a little bit of money in your commissary account, so you could get like personal hygiene products, or like taste a little something other than prison food for your entire sentence. And so I mean, is it that much? I don't know. And we don't know exactly what's happening in China, and there's not even all that great of reporting what's happening in the U.S. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the prison in St. Louis, the prisoners there busted out the window and were like holding up signs asking for court hearings and stuff like that, because they just weren't doing it during COVID. People are just locked up the whole time. We could go through and spend like 5 or 6 shows, Pat. Me and you could probably just on the top of our head go through different cases in the United States where atrocious things happened in our prison system, complete injustice. Not to even mention, the worst state in Guantanamo Bay and all that, but just kind of looking at our own internal prison system. It's pretty bad, right? And so again, this comes down one of the things why I hate qualifying, having to say I wouldn't want to live in China, just because if I were a person in the U.S., especially a minority who grew up in the inner city, I might say like I wouldn't want to be this person in the U.S. either. So.
Well, and how the big joke in the United States is that people get raped in prison. Well, isn't that an allegation of what was happening to the Uyghurs?
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. In to be okay. So this is a whole nother thing to get into, is these Uyghur whistleblowers, if you would call that, these escapees who end up escaping these camps. And what happens is they escape from these camps. They get picked up by one of the various Uyghur associations. The World Uyghur Congress is one of these associations. They have satellite organizations in a bunch of different countries. They get interviewed when they escape, very soon after they escape. And sometimes in the case, the most famous case of Sergul Sautbay, she had a hearing in Kazakhstan because she tried to sneak into Kazakhstan and claim asylum. She had a hearing there. She gave some testimony. What ends up happening is that she got taken to Sweden, and she is participating in more interviews there that are arranged by the Swedish Uyghur, not the Swedish Uyghur Conference, but the World Uyghur Conference. And her story changes from the testimony she gave in Kazakhstan and the various interviews that she gave in, that area. And then, all of a sudden she's picked up by Haaretz. There's handlers. Sorry about that. There's handlers that are arranging interviews with her, according to the Haaretz interview, says that itself. And all of a sudden, she's making all these bombastic claims about how she was a detainee, that she witnessed rape on many occasions, horrific violence, that Uyghurs were forced to eat pork, and that doesn't jive with anything she said in the beginning. In the beginning, she said that she was a instructor in the camp and that she was instructing other Chinese Communist Party members, because she was a Chinese Communist Party member, how to teach kindergarten classes, and that was her job. And she said, in an earlier interview, that she was driven to work every day. Well, then all of a sudden, when she gets to Sweden, and she testifies that she was imprisoned in this camp. So which one is it? And not to mention the fact that all these Uyghur associations have ties to the CIA, and the Gray Zone did a bunch of really great reporting on this, kind of blowing off those connections. But at the same time, organizations like Radio Free Asia are involved as well. And the New York Times did an expose about how Radio Free Asia was started by the CIA. So there's all of these suspicious connections here. Tursunay Ziauddin is another one of these very famous whistleblowers, and the BBC ran with Ziauddin's testimony. And her testimony was radically different from the first interview she gave when she left. Now, you could say, playing devil's advocate, you could say that, well, the closer they were to China, the more afraid they were of getting taken back. So they kind of held things under the table. I think there's some merit to that argument. But once you see the connections to the U.S. State Department and the changing of the story, it's specifically the connections and the changing of the story. It just makes it very, very suspicious, and I don't think that it's very credible testimony. Not to mention, sorry, Kyle, the fact that eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. And in my wrongful convictions class in law school, we examined many, 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 many cases of wrongful conviction that were caused by eyewitness testimony.
Yeah, all fantastic points. And, as you say there at the end, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong, but it's a reason to question it and, to not take it on its face. I feel the same way about somebody who's becoming a celebrity in libertarian circles right now, Yeonmi Park, who was a North Korean defector. And there's a great article in 2014 in The Diplomat that goes through how she, has changed her story. And she has some explanations for it, some of which, made sense, that she didn't remember certain situations the right way because they were like 14 when she was happening, or that maybe her parents told her a little bit of a different story to protect a child. It made sense how things happen that way. But it's also a reason to question some of the, the claims that she's making, and especially when stories have evolved as drastically as hers, or some of these Uyghur defectors, where, it's not like it was, Tuesday the 19th, but actually it was Tuesday the 26th. That's not the question here. It's major things like, were you a prisoner, or were you driven to camp the camp every day? Was it a job? Or was it forced labor? Were you watching rape happen, or was there no rape? These are all drastically different things, and so, and again, we don't know, but again, neither does Tim Pool or any of these people in the alternative media, who don't have information other than what we're going through here today. So, Pat, before we wrap up, I would like to talk about China Uncensored, because that is probably, if you're on YouTube, that's probably the most popular, maybe other than the Epic Times, the most popular thing people know that really pushes this anti-China propaganda. So what's wrong, or why should we be skeptical of the statements, the claims, and everything made and pushed by China Uncensored?
Yeah. Before we get into that, there were a few things that didn't make it into the documentary about Sarah Gross-Soutby specifically that I just wanted to interject. One, she was given the International Woman of Courage Award by Mike Pompeo, which I think should raise some eyebrows. The other thing is, take this for what it's worth, but her family back in China has said that she cheated them over And the Chinese government says that she has like $46,000 in gambling debts. And so there's some character assassination there, but I think it's worth considering just for what it's worth.
Right.
Uh,
It
given the
could be that her family needs to say that to like protect their
right.
status in China. It's possible that that's true, and the reason she fled China is because she had gambling debt. And you
Right.
go either way.
Yeah. So take it for what it's worth, but I think it illuminates a little bit more of the situation. So China Uncensored is a very interesting matter, and Tim Pool's had China Uncensored on his IRL show 3 times in the last 6 months. So there was one before December, one in March, and then one just in June here. And China Uncensored is a YouTube channel. There's purportedly it's a 4-person team, but they have a huge operation, and they have several different channels. They have over 1 million subscribers. They put out 3 to 4 videos a week on just one channel. So I included a video by Nathan Rich, who is a former member of Scientology. He grew up in Scientology. He has a kind of a storied past. He lives in China. He speaks Chinese. I believe he has some Chinese heritage, but he works at a tech company in China. So he's a person who he loves China. He's very open about that. He is offended by the fact that a lot of people just crap on China all the time, and that there's these vicious rumors about China. So he goes around kind of debunking things is kind of what he does, but consider the source, of course. But I included a really, really thorough and convincing video that he did about China Uncensored. So specifically, there is this religious group called Falun Gong. And Falun Gong is it was started by Li Hongzhi in China in the 1990s. And he started the spiritualist movement of Qigong exercises, which is a very generic term for certain types of exercises. And it's basically meditations, but he created this whole spiritualist system. He got a lot of adherents. At some point, he ran afoul of the Chinese Communist Party. He fled to the United States with a bunch of his followers, Falun Gong practitioners. And essentially what they did is they started the Epic Times, and they started New Tang Dynasty, which is they're both nonprofit news sources. However, it is fair to say that Falun Gong was heavily persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party, who called them terrorists. It's possible that they disappeared members of Falun Gong. So I don't know where you want to go from there.
Well, so exactly, I guess, what are the ties between the two groups? Because from my understanding, China Uncensored really tries to downplay, and like they're this grassroots kind of just a couple guys doing a podcast situation, and it's really not that.
Right. So they have this they had a video because there were a lot of rumors going around that China Uncensored was produced by New Tang Dynasty, and that the members of China Uncensored were Falun Gong practitioners. And they denied this in a video. They said we're crowdfunded. It's just the 4 of us making these videos in our bed, in the producer's living room, essentially. And Nathan Rich goes through and systematically just blows this out of the water. In fact, the host of the show, Chris Chappell, he is a Falun Gong practitioner. So is Cindy, I think her name is. She's they call her like the comedian of the group or whatever. They all work at NTD. They all work in New Tang Dynasty, and you can find this out through several ways. Is that if you go on Social Blade and you type in NTD New Tang Dynasty China Uncensored, their channel comes up. Their channel address is New Tang Dynasty. Their producer on his LinkedIn profile says that he works for New Tang Dynasty and China Uncensored. And Chris Chappell has that too. So in Chris Chappell was posted on various leader discussion boards that he got interested in Falun Gong, and so there's all these connections here. This is This is problematic, and the reason it's problematic is because Li Hongzhi addressed New Tang Dynasty and he addressed the Epic Times, um, and he gave them their marching orders. He's the charismatic leader of Falun Gong. He gave them their marching orders, which was to expose the evil of the Chinese Communist Party and to destroy the Chinese Communist Party and to infiltrate the media and to promote their message. I'm quoting that. I'm not making that up. That was the message. So there's a lot of hate, and I've received criticism for including Nathan Rich, his video in the documentary, because he is not kind to Falun Gong. I think he's biased because he grew up in Scientology, but he calls them a cult. I say that former Falun Gong practitioners that have left Falun Gong have also called Falun Gong a cult. I don't believe that necessarily, I don't want to smear these people or make them into Branch Davidians. I don't think, as long as they're peaceful, I don't think that the U.S. should arrest them or get involved or encircle their compound, which they have in New York. To each their own. I did include a link to a Medium article by a former Falun Gong practitioner who says that he was never, he left the group. It's very stringent and controlled by Li Hongzhi. They kind of take advantage of their members by utilizing their volunteer efforts towards NTD and the Epic Times. That Li Hongzhi makes all the money off of that they're very insular and closed off. He said there's no evidence of, he was never threatened with violence. He was free to leave at any time. So judge of that what you will. Again, the same with Adrian Zenz. I do believe that their beliefs, and this is why I included it in the documentary, I think that their beliefs are admissible, or at least they're relevant. They're relevant to the claims that they're making, because in the claims they're making, Kyle, are that of organ harvesting. And this is the most bombastic claim that Tim Pool has allowed on his show, China Uncensored.
He really hits home on this.
He does, yeah. And so he talks about how the Chinese Communist Party is systematically harvesting the organs of Falun Gong practitioners in China. He lets China Uncensored talk about this, wax poetic about it for quite some time.
Right, and he's even suggested that one of the reasons the Uyghurs are now being targeted is because they ran out of Falun Gong organs. I don't know if that's if that's just a complete Tim Pool fabrication, or he got that from China Uncensored or some other group, but it doesn't seem like anybody has any evidence at all that could possibly be true. And that, the situation with the Uyghurs seems like the kind of the same playbook that China has rolled out in like Tibet or any of the other places that aren't ethnically Han Chinese, but nonetheless the Chinese Communist Party claims are within the borders of China. And depending on how old the maps you go back and look at are and stuff like what you want to debate on, I don't think borders should exist at all, but there are countries, and so where those borders are drawn are complicated questions, right? And so that's anyways that was kind of just where I was going with that, is that this isn't necessarily a particular organ harvesting situation plotted out against the Uyghurs, but more just kind of what China has been doing. It's like if somebody said that the U.S. invaded Yemen to steal organs. It's like, no, they didn't. The U.S. is doing terrible things in Yemen, but that has nothing to do with organs.
Right, and Falun Gong has always been behind these accusations of organ harvesting, and I don't know if you Google Falun Gong organ harvesting or China organ harvesting, you'll see a lot of pictures of Falun Gong practitioners holding banners talking about organ harvesting. There was a report they put out called Dark Harvest, and I linked to this in my article about this subject. But what Falun Gong did is they took a bunch of their own doctors and they used those doctors' testimony or to write this report saying that organ harvesting is happening on an industrial scale. And let me emphasize, industrial scale. And the Gray Zone went through it and debunked this, and quoted real Chinese doctors and other doctors and really just kind of blew this out of the water too. And I linked to that in my article as well.
Yeah. So, Pat, I want to wrap up and I want to not go over every last thing, although there's a lot more that you have in this documentary. But I mean, everybody, this is filled with articles from like the Gray Zone, Matt Blumenthal and Gareth Porter, interviews of the Scott Horton Show with Eric Margulies and Gareth Porter. I think you have quotes from Peter Lee and just all the China experts in here. You really go through and break it down. You're not, just repeating what the Chinese government says. You're not just saying that nothing bad is happening in China. You're going through and you're breaking down the particular war propaganda and getting into it. You're not saying that Assad's a good guy. You're saying that he didn't use chemical weapons. You're not saying that Saddam Hussein was a good guy. You're saying the Iraqi troops didn't take babies out of incubators. You're not saying that Gaddafi didn't commit any war crimes or have extrajudicial killings or tortured people on behalf of the U.S., but rather he didn't give his soldiers Viagra to rape women and wasn't planning on committing a genocide in Benghazi. And it's important to be able to draw these lines and distinctions because the ridiculous and insane propaganda like accusations of organ harvesting and genocide radicalizes the American people to demand war, and then we go in and create even worse situations for all these groups in the first place. Not that I think the U.S. would try to go in and overthrow the communist government, but the more support that the U.S. government has from the people to go in and carry out some kind of intervention in China, overtly maybe it'll lead to sanctions. Covertly, who knows what the CIA might want to do, who they might want to try to train, and this would probably cause the Chinese government to crack down even more on the Uyghurs, see them as potential stooges of the Americans to undermine China, and would rightfully identify that the American government doesn't give a damn about the Uyghurs, right? If they were located in a different area of the world where it was Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, any of our European allies, Turkey, that wanted to go out and demolish these people, we would absolutely stand by and let it happen, if not fund it and provide the military equipment to make it possible. We don't care that Turkey is doing this to the Kurds, that Israel is doing this to the Palestinian, that Saudi is doing this to the Houthis, or any other place that we have go through a bunch of them. But because the war propaganda, they're going to push Americans to demand more and more intervention, and not only are we destroying what could be a profitable relationship with China, but at the same time probably pushing the U.S. on the convert to take more and more actions against China, and it's going to end up bad for everyone.
Yeah, in on a final note, to your point, the purported reasons for this camp in the first place is to combat Chinese Uyghur extremism, and the U.S.'s fingerprints are all over that already. They've been involved, like I said, the Eric Margulies testimony, but more recently, Colonel Larry Wilkerson said in that speech, and in a more recent Scott Horton interview, that there were up to 20,000 Uyghur terrorists fighting in Syria on the behalf of al-Qaeda, that they were aided in their journey there by Turkey and perhaps some say trained by Turkey. Well, those soldiers are purportedly coming back to Xinjiang, and they are reportedly being helped through Afghanistan by certain forces that might be connected to the U.S. State Department. China knows this and has heard these rumors, and they are petrified about these, because they see these Uyghurs as trained and experienced jihadi terrorists. So, I mean, we can expect more, that's the motivation for the crackdown in the first place.
Right. And, you can only imagine what the U.S. would do and what the U.S. has done in the same situation. But anyways, Pat, thank you so much for coming back on the show and putting together this great documentary. I really hope people take the time to not only watch it, but then share it out and recommend it. It's the kind of thing that I think libertarians, everybody, but especially libertarians, really need to see, as so many of the people who, do seem like independent voices, who do a lot of times have interesting things to say, who won't just walk the mainstream media lines, who aren't just interested in keeping up with most of the same old government policies or even fighting the same old wars. A lot of these people are against the conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. but they're not anti-war, and they want conflict, and to be able to debunk their most absurd claims and put this in perspective is so important. So thank you so much, Pat. People, check it out. Libertarian Institute, Liberty underscore weekly on Twitter. Is that it?
Yep. Yep, that's it.
All right. Thanks, Pat, and we'll do this again soon.
Thanks, Kyle.